Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. This is our Toilets to Tenants first meeting of the year. Today, we are going to review the Denver rules and your lease. And so this is sponsored by myself. I'm a real estate agent with HomeSmart and Vanessa, and we're going to just do a quick market update before we get into leases. One thing to note, we are going to make this an interactive presentation, so feel free to use the chat. Vanessa is going to be monitoring the chat window, or if you feel comfortable, you can ask questions throughout the presentation. Just unmute yourself, and when you're done talking, please mute. We do ask you not to reference any tenant names, your address of properties. We want to, keep your questions generic and not reference personal information. And then I hear some noise, so if you're not muted, please go ahead and mute. Okay, so just a quick market update. We're starting to see, after the craziness of the last 2 to 3 years, we're starting to see a little bit more balanced market. And that is due mostly to the increase in interest rates. So the buyer demand that we were seeing a year ago, we're not seeing as much. Buyers are coming back. And what we're seeing is that sellers they're not getting the great price appreciation that we were seeing in the last 2 to 3 years. Prices are about flat, very similar to what they were last year, but we are seeing homes, days on market are a little bit longer. We are seeing homes go under contract quickly, just because there's not a lot of inventory, but we're just not seeing the huge price swings. This was put out by the Denver Metro Association of Realtors. It's just talking about inventory. Part of the problem is people aren't selling their homes. And so we're seeing, that low inventory is causing things that go on the market that are priced correctly, that have updates. They are going under contract relatively quickly. We're also seeing kind of the rental market prices are kind of flat with that as well. So we're not seeing as great appreciation as we were. Part of it is affordability. Our market is just becoming more and more unaffordable. We're seeing a lot more roommate situations. We're seeing, co-signers with parents helping kids with rental properties. So that's kind of what we're seeing, as our big rental season is usually in the spring. So you're going to get your best prices between March and June. And so we'll see when March hits, if prices are very similar to what they were a year ago, or if we are seeing some increase with rental rates. So I'd say if you have a rental coming on this year, just make sure you are gauging what the prices of your competition is doing. Because the worst thing you can do right now is overprice, and then you're vacant for 3, 4, 5 months, because that's just affecting cash flow. Okay, I'm going to turn this over to Vanessa.
Hey, so hi everybody, Vanessa McLennan, Universal Lending. Nina mentioned that the rates were higher, and I think everybody knows that, right? That's no surprise to anybody. Another thing that is coming are called LLPAs, which are loan level price adjustments. And what this means is that they are going to be charging more for second homes and rental properties. These are pricing hits that have always been there, right? We know that if your credit is better, you get a better rate. We know that if you put down more money, you get a better rate. But we're seeing some really big hits now for investment properties, and second homes used to price the same as primary properties or very close, and now they are pricing the same as investment properties, which is a big jump. Also, big differences if you buy a condo versus a single family home. That's another big hit. And then one that affects, me the most is a debt to income loan level adjustment, which is different. And because a lot of us have secondary employment or rentals on our tax returns or a separate business, however you have yours set up, most times you guys don't know what an underwriter can give you for income. So when you start going over into the higher debt to income range, you're going to have pricing hits. This is hard for you to predict because if you go out there and you just start pricing between different lenders and you don't really know your income because you may not have been underwritten, that's going to vary a lot. So I don't want people to think that people are doing the bait and switch, but just know you want to be underwritten so you know what your rate is and what that property will cost you as much as you can. Because if we can't use all of your income, or if you're writing it off, you're going to pay more for that loan. I'm good. Nina, that's good.
All right. So Vanessa, just the quick $1 million question. What do you think interest rates will do this year, and how do you think that'll affect our market?
I think that people need to stop saying they're going to go down. I think that if they do, then that's nice and that's great. But the number of people that are banking that these are going to go down within 3 months, they thought they were going to go down last year. They didn't think this was going to happen, and it did very easily. So I don't see them doing a big dive down anytime soon. And the increased rates keeps the market slower. However, the moment that these rates do dip, you see the flurry of activity and the property is going over asking and $30,000, $40,000 over. So if you're thinking of buying a property, now is not a bad time. You have more negotiation, and the rates are not horrible statistically. We got very used to 3% rates very quickly, and people want it back, and they're waiting for it, which I don't think is a good idea. But that's me.
Okay. Well, thank you for the update. With that, we're going to start talking about leases. Just some basics about leases. In Colorado, there is no standard lease. And, unlike if you purchase a property or sell a property, we have a Colorado contract. Leases do not follow that aspect. You can find a lot of leases available online. It is a good practice to find a lease that you like and then create what we call a master lease and have it reviewed by attorney. Vanessa and I are not attorneys. We don't by habit share our leases. I will share it with my specific clients. But, we recommend that you do use an attorney to review your lease and make sure if there's things in particular with your house or your rental that they are covered. Is there a question? Okay. And then continuing on, if your property was built prior to 1978, make sure you have a lead-based paint disclosure as part of your lease. It is a separate document that you can download, through the EPA. And then it is required, it's a federal law for any property built to prior to 1978. And there is a lease pamphlet that you can give prospective renters. Then the last thing is in Denver, the rental registration program is in effect. If you have a multifamily unit, and I'm getting some feedback, can everybody make sure they're muted? I might have to quickly see who's not muted. Okay, sorry about that.
You're muted and your camera's not turned on.
Okay, I'm still getting some feedback. So rental registration license is required for multifamily units. So just know that you need to now, if you're advertising multifamily unit, you need to put that license number in your advertising. I recommend you also put it in your lease. Single families you have until the end of the year, but good practice is to put it in your lease as well. I think I sent a link out to our group, but they are starting to they're starting to send notes saying, hey, you're not licensed. This is your first warning, and then they're going to start to fine. From what I understand is they've started with the multi-units that have some health and safety issues. And then they actually hired a third-party company that's going to start going through Zillow. If anything looks like it's a multifamily unit, they're gonna start investigating and looking to make sure you have a license. Okay, the other new rule that came around, I think it was last year, is once you have a signed lease with a tenant, within 7 days, you need to either email them or give them a paper copy of the lease. And then you also need to give them this document that's called the Denver Tenant Rights and Resources document. I think it's like 5 or 6 pages. So that is required so that tenants know what their rights are in Denver. And so that is something that you need to make sure you do, because you could be liable if you don't send it to them. Okay, so just to go over parts of a lease. And again, this isn't interactive. So if you have a specific question on a part of a lease, or you have some thoughts on things that have worked with your lease, we would love to have the feedback. So a lease is a written agreement. So in Colorado, you need to have it in writing. An oral agreement is not going to come to play. Always get everything in writing. Like, oh, I talked to my tenant and they said they do this. Put it in writing. If it's not specifically in the lease, and you agree to do something afterwards, you can do an addendum to your lease, just reflect the lease and just say, here is what tenant and landlord agreed to, and it is an amendment to the lease on this date. Leases, like I said, must be written to be enforceable, and they are 30 days or longer. If you are doing less than 30 days, that's considered a short-term rental, and you need to follow the short-term rental rules. So in Denver, it needs to be licensed for your short-term rental. It needs to be your primary, or it needs to be it can either be your whole primary house or part of a primary house. So what they're trying to avoid is having investors come and buy properties and suddenly turn these into boarding houses and, having short-term rentals everywhere. And then the lease just says what the tenant is responsible for and what the landlord is responsible for. Okay, and I'm getting some feedback, so I'm going to quickly do a scan and see. Okay. All right. So going on. Okay, so in your lease, make sure you mention the tenant and the landlord names. You want to list all adults residing at the property. One of my rentals, just for an example, I had a tenant there and, I listed his name, and suddenly there were different people living there, and people would move in and people would move out. And I realized they were doing some short-term rentals. So now I really say, hey, here's the person who's on here. And then I mentioned anybody who's an adult that's staying more than a few days, they have to be part of this lease. And I need to know about it. The other thing is make sure you include the address. If you've got kind of a tricky address, include the legal description, just to make sure it's really clear this is what you're renting. Your lease term, your start and your end date. And then as part of your lease term, so typically our leases are a year. You can do shorter, you can do greater, but you always want to have an end date so that you can kind of show people where your lease starts, when it ends. And then you also want to include what your notice is to vacate. So I typically do a 30 or 45 day notice. So, a month and a half before their lease is due, or even 2 months, I'll say, hey, let me know what your plans are. And then I ask them within 45 days to let me know, because then I know I can start advertising within 30 days. So, and then you also want to mention, if you don't come to an agreement on a new lease, can those current tenants just go month to month after the lease? So, if you don't have a new lease in place, I usually don't do the month to month. I always want to have a start term and an end term, so it's clear. Okay, so rent amounts. So this is probably a very important part of the contract. So you want to put what your rent amount is and when it's due. And then I also include, when I have someone sign a lease, I ask for half a month of that first month rent at signing, or even the full month's rent, because that way I tell them you're committed, this is non-refundable. I'm stopping advertising. So that way I know I'm not going to have somebody who's just signing a lease and then they find something better and then I'm out. So that's what I do as part of the lease signing is I have them pay an amount. And I also set them up. I use a system called Turbo Tenant. So I will automatically set them up in that. And I will say, go ahead and pay this first part of the rent. And then this part is due on this date. And so that manages all of my payments. Zillow does it, apartments.com, but I recommend using an online payment system. It just will make your life so much easier. I also don't accept cash because I feel like there's too much discrepancy. If somebody's dropping off cash and they shorted you $20, it's their word against your word. So I don't do cash. If someone really wants to pay in cash, what I do is I say, go to my bank. You can then ask to deposit the cash in my bank account. And then I know the bank has verified the money. And so I know that everything's getting paid. Okay, the new rule that came into place, I believe it was in 2021, is that late fees. You cannot charge a late fee within the first 7 days of your payment. So if you always charge rent on the first day of the month, you cannot charge any late fees until after the 7th. And then there's a new stipulation that your late fees cannot exceed either $50 or 5% of the amount of past due rent. So that is something new. So you should make sure you are looking at your lease and that you've revised that. And then this is all coming about. If you want to read more about it, it's in Colorado Senate Bill 173. And then know that if somebody pays the rent, but they don't pay the late fee, you cannot evict or you cannot terminate because of late fees. However, one of the things you could do is you could apply the late fees from the security deposit and then ask that tenant to pay back the security deposit. But, there's that caution there because if you start to use your security deposit and they're not paying your late fee, they're probably not going to pay your security deposit back. And if there's a lot of damage, you want to use that with the security deposit. So that's just a risk and something to think about. Okay. And again, if you have questions, Vanessa's monitoring the chat, or if you want to jump in, just unmute yourself, but we ask you to mute yourself again. Okay, so notice and condition. It's really important on how you're going to communicate with your tenant, email, text, phone call. I try to do everything in writing. I find that text seems to be the quickest and fastest way that I can get in touch with my tenants. If it's something not urgent, I will send them an email. And then I always keep that as a backup, just in case it's their word against my word. Security deposit. Typically, it's 1 month of rent. However, you can make it less. You could make it more. I've heard of people saying, I let this tenant in. They were a little bit risky. I increased the security deposit. Or somebody might say, I know the tenant, I'm going to not charge a full month's rent. If you are a real estate agent in Colorado, you're required to put the security deposit in an escrow or trust account. So just be aware that you need to work with your bank and make sure it's an escrow or trust account. And then you cannot commingle funds, which means you can't put the security deposit with your own, with your own personal escrow trust account. It has to be separate. So again, we mentioned that you could use your security deposit to cover late fees if that's written in the list, and then having the tenant replenish the security deposit. And again, you cannot use security deposit. Your tenant cannot use security deposit to pay rent unless you specifically have it in the lease. So that's just something to think about, that security deposit is really for damage to the property. And then condition of premises. Residents must be in good working order and safe condition. And then the tenant agrees to rent as is. So. Okay, use of premises. This is probably a pretty important one. And this is just to make sure that you're in agreement with your tenant on how they're going to use that property. You know, do they have a home business? Are you okay with that home business? Are they running things out of the garage or out of the house? Can they run a short-term rental? They can, but you need to get it licensed. And again, you need to make sure you understand who's responsible for what. Do you allow smoking or vaping in the house or on the properties? Will you allow a grow operation? You need to make sure your tenant is compliant with local laws. And then one that I've added to my is trash around the property. So, you know, so that you know, trash is being picked up and that they're responsible for that. Okay. And then we talked about condition. I think some of these might be a double one. And then entry. And then, you know what, Vanessa, would you mind walking through this next slide? I just had somebody ring my doorbell and I have to get that. Vanessa, are you there?
Yeah, I'm unmuted.
Could you walk through this real quick? Because I just had somebody ring my doorbell.
Okay, so maintenance, it's very good to outline who is responsible and what sort of damage will you cover as typical use, and what should they cover as damage to the property, right? Their kid flushes a toy down the toilet and you have a large plumber bill and they fish out a stuffed animal. To me, that's theirs, right? But I would outline that so that it's sure whose is what. But I would make sure that they know that they have to replace the batteries in the smoke detectors because they won't do it if not. And you don't want to be dinged for something dangerous like that. As much as you can cover that. You know, they should give you notice if they're going to paint, if you even allow it. And I would put it in my lease. I do not allow you to paint without written agreement from me. Because if they paint the walls purple and you have to go back in and turn it back to a neutral color, it'll cost a lot of money. And also holes in the walls, mounting TVs, things like that can be a big deal to clean up after they leave because they're not going to clean it up. We know that, or typically that they should be responsible for cleaning it up. You know, and what does a tenant pay? We have the new trash rules and they have to pick their trash can. So make sure that they know that that is now your bill. And if you have a lease that's already in line, you might want to do an addendum for the trash. The trash is no longer covered. It's this amount. Just so you know, they can apply to have that fee covered, even though they're renting. They can prove their lower income with the city and possibly get that waived for themselves, just so you know. Okay, Nina, you good? No.
Yeah, so, sorry about that. I was like multitasking. The one thing about trash recycling and compost is very similar to water in that if it's not paid, there can be a lien put on the property. The other thing is it's paid quarterly. So if you have, you know, it's a lot of switching around. And so I think, you know, just for my properties, we're probably going to cover it because I feel like it's going to be a lot of, oh, if somebody moves out, they've already paid, now I owe them money, you know, because it's billed quarterly and they won't do it like in Excel, it makes it a little bit more difficult. So I think, you know, just for my properties, I'm going to make my life easy and probably just cover it. And again, like we'll cover the basic. And if somebody wants like a bigger trash can, we'll then charge maybe a little more rent. So that's how I'm going to handle it. Okay, pets is a big one. And it's really important to have this in your lease as well as have an addendum. So again, if you don't allow pets, you should have a clause in that says pets are not allowed without written consent from the landlord. You always want to have at least something that mentions pets or no pets. If you allow pets, how many? Is it a dog? Is it a cat? That kind of thing. Right now, you can charge a pet deposit. You can charge a monthly pet fee. However, there is a new House Bill 23-1068, which could eliminate any fees being charged by landlords. This is being introduced by Representative Alex Valdez. So I would say contact him. I've already written him. I haven't gotten a response back. And your local representative, and tell them this is not really a good idea, because their thought was, oh, the state will have a fund for pet fees. And so if you have damage from a pet, you can go to this fund and you can get up to $1,000. I really don't think that's a good use of taxpayer time, taxpayer money, and a good use of our representatives' time managing some pet fee. So if you don't agree with that, please contact your local representative. Another thing to make sure to address is your waste and cleanup of the yard with dogs. I try to put in there that the tenant is responsible for cleanup, within 2 days, just to make sure they're doing it on a regular basis. The other big one is service animals and emotional pets. With service animals and properly licensed emotional pets, you cannot charge any fees. However, you can ask for proper documentation. So if it's a service animal or a properly licensed emotional pet, you can say, oh, can you please share your doctor's note with me? You can't ask why they have the service pet, but you can ask for proper documentation. And I know somebody told me what they do is they ask when somebody says, oh, I have a service animal or I have an emotional pet, you can't charge me. They say, okay, then within 48 hours, I need to see your proper documentation and there will not be any fees charged. If they can't, then you can go ahead and charge those fees. So, and again, you want to make sure tenant is responsible for any damages and injuries caused by pets residing at the property. So pets is probably one of the biggest areas where we hear complaints between landlords and tenants. Often tenants will just bring in another pet and not think anything of it and not tell the landlord. So, I had one case where, the tenant was like, oh, well, I pet sit, and they would have like additional pets that we weren't aware of. And I'm like, well, that's, if you're pet sitting long-term, then that's another pet. So, again, it's something that you have to kind of work out. Okay, so other considerations, insurance. So I require rental insurance for my tenants. And so that's something that you should make sure that your tenants have and that they put you on as the additional insurer on the policy. And they can just contact whoever they use for their car rental, or some people say, I'd like you to use this rental insurance company and I have, an agreement with them. So again, it's something just to good practice to also put that in the lease. Another big one is what happens when you've got roommates or you've got a couple and somebody leaves. So this gets into the assignment, subleasing, and release. I do allow people to sublease, or if it's a roommate situation and one roommate moves out, but they have another one moving in, I do allow them to do that, but I have to approve the person moving in. I do charge a fee for that. And then I create a new addendum that references the original lease. I also tell the tenants, I'm not refunding any security deposits, so you need to work that out amongst yourselves. I only give the security deposit back at the end of the lease term. So they need to kind of work that out, because you can get into situations where you're kind of the middle person and one person's arguing with another. The other thing that is probably a good practice too is when you have somebody move out, do a walkthrough of the house, just so you know what the condition is, when that new person's moving in. And then attorney fees in Colorado. So whoever is the losing party will pay the fees, regardless of who filed the complaint. And I think that's been a change in law Where previously, you know, if you filed the complaint, the landlord could say, okay, you're still going to pay my attorney fees. So now they're trying to balance it out a little bit more. So. Okay, so that is what I had for my slides. I don't know if anybody else has any other information that they wanted to share, or, you know, things coming up the pike. I know we've got a lot of new laws that came into place with the rental registry, with, you know, late fees. So it's been kind of a challenge keeping up with that, of giving people the tenant right document. You know, it's a good practice though, every year to, as you have a new lease coming about, review that lease. And like I said, it's a good practice to create a master lease, have attorney review it, and make sure all the things that are important to you are really covered. You know, like they say, always cover your butt in this business. Vanessa, do you have anything you want to add, you know, from your lease experience?
No, not really. One thing I did find interesting is that the reason that they are trying to make rental pet rules much easier on the tenant and harder, which ends up being harder on us, is because they were noticing so many pets were being abandoned at the shelters. And they would say, the reason they would give is, I rent and my landlord won't take the pet, or I can't afford the pet fees. So this is why the city is trying to do this, is to keep the shelters, because, you know what I mean? I'm not saying I agree with it, but I did find that interesting. Who knows if that's really the reason why people abandon their pets, but I thought it was interesting.
Sure.
I don't have anything else.
Yeah, and so anybody before we end, can you have more than one lease for the same property? I don't, that's kind of an interesting question. I guess if you have a property that has like a basement and then an upstairs, you probably could do a lease for one separate part and then a lease for another. So I don't know if your question is, if you have more than one person renting, if they each have their own lease, that can get tricky. You know, if it's strictly a single family property, I would say you want to have one lease, because you can get into, you know, a disagreement of which lease really prevails over the other one.
I have multiple leases for a single family property that is college. It's in Fort Collins. So I basically say it's for the bedroom and the common areas. That's how I do it, because I didn't want one person. I didn't want everybody on the same lease. I just didn't. I just thought I would rather have it separate for each person and their own deposit and all of that. So I have it. I have multiple leases for one property.
Okay. So Vanessa, what happens if it just moves out? You know,
then I don't have the other ones responsible for that payment. I can go and re-rent that bedroom. You know, it's in a college town. That's how I did it. And I did it that way because my son had gotten stuck with somebody who just left. And I just didn't find that fair, because if you can't sublease, I don't let them sublet at all. So I'd rather be able to put a new tenant in that room with a shorter lease.
okay. So your leases on the same property could be staggered in terms of one ends here, one, you know, and then
I would have them all end together, but they may start at different times if somebody moves in and takes that bedroom that somebody else left.
okay. Then who's responsible for, let's say somebody moves out, who's responsible for finding a tenant for that bedroom?
I guess I am, but I have their security deposit that they left and broke their lease.
Yeah. Okay. That's an interesting way to do it, you know.
Yeah.
And I think you know, especially in a college town, that could, you know, that sounds like more of the norm, where I don't know if I would do it if it wasn't for college students. You know, I don't know if I would want to get involved with managing roommates separately.
Finances, and I see multiple leases often. where people rent a bedroom in a home. They may have a 4-bedroom home that's near the airport, and they may rent 1 bedroom plus access to the common spaces in their lease. So I do see it because I'm going through and determining income. So it does happen pretty often where there's multiple leases for the same property.
Okay. Okay, somebody asked a question, assuming there is no change to the master lease, do you typically give the whole lease or an addendum when a tenant renews? I typically just create a whole new lease because our laws have been changing so quickly that I've got to actually, every time the year comes up, I have to make sure the whole lease follows the new rules. So I just find it easier if I just create a whole new lease and then that's what I send them. But I know some people will do an addendum and the addendum says, hey, your rent's now this much, or hey, you now have a pet. So, you know, I think you can do it either way, as long as you reference that original lease, the date that they signed it, and say, this is an addendum to that original lease. Does that make sense? Okay, do you have the Denver pet license as a requirement for the lease too? I do recommend that people get their pets licensed because it is a requirement in Denver. But do I actually follow up? I actually haven't. So I would say I ask them to do it, but I don't go to the aspect of going, oh, I called the city and your pet isn't licensed. You know, and maybe I should, but I asked them to do it. Okay, any other questions? I think that's all I have. So thank you so much. Vanessa and I will talk, and we'll probably do another Zoom call in about 2 months or so. And so if there's any topics that people are interested in, you know, we can, if some of these new legislation rules come about, we can definitely have some people come on and talk about that. I'll probably have someone come and talk about, you know, the new, the emotional pets and, you know, pets in general, because that seems to be a big one where we're seeing the most amount of, you know, interest. And then I saw a question about somebody asking about attorneys. We can send a list of recommended attorneys, you know, and if other people have a recommendation, we can send something to our Facebook page too. So yeah. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. We're so glad you could join us. And again, you know, use our Facebook page for questions. It seems like it's been kind of slow lately. But we look forward to talking to everybody in about 2 months. All right, thank you.